It was a sad time every time because he never actually knew whether he'd ever see us again or not. And it always puzzled me why he would do that. But we discovered it in years, those who went in there and always stayed at the coal mine, that it was an addictive thing. Somehow it was a challenge to them to overcome danger. It was a challenge to them to put themselves in that black dungeon and work in there and come out again to the daylight. And even after we moved down here in Virginia in 1945, it was hard for Seth to stay away from the coal mines. After he was down here a year or so, he'd take me out walking, and I would know what was coming out. We'd say, well, let's go out walking. And he would try to talk me into going back to West Virginia so he could go back in the coal mines. And I always told him no. I would not go back to West Virginia in the coal mines, but I won't keep you from going. If that's where that you want to be and that's what you want to do, you go, but I'm not going to let my boys, my kids, go back and become a coal miner, because that was a fearful part of my life, and I never wanted my children to be in the coal mines. And finally he settled the fact that he was getting older and he could never go back in the coal mines anymore because the back trouble that he had began to develop more, and he knew he couldn't take that anymore because he had fallen off a house when he was 16 years old, putting a roof on a house, and hurt his back, and really he had back trouble from then on. And so after we were down here a while, he began to think of it as his home here, but he would get homesick every once in a while and tell the coal mine stories and want to go back. But I had made up my mind when I left West Virginia that God had moved me down here because of a special time when Seth was in the service during World War II, right at the last of the war, when they were drafting anybody they could get because so many men had been killed and it was so rough. They were taking married men with children and anybody that they could. And so Seth and Pete went. They were called, drafted, and they went for their examination, and Seth never thought he would ever be taken in because of the back trouble. He thought that they'd send him home, and he could get a job and go back to work. But he thought they'd take Pete because Pete was 9 years younger than him. And when it was over, they sent Pete home and kept your dad. And he was in the Army and in the infantry. And the marching, and the training and all that marching and everything, it just got him down to the place. He looked like a ghost, really. The men in the battalion with him, platoon or battalion, I forget which they called it, they'd have to get him up out of the bed of a morning and put his backpack on him and help him get dressed and go, because until you really fell out completely, the sergeants did not believe you were doing anything but faking, because they thought you were going to have to go to war and you didn't want to go to war. And after he got to the place that he just fell out on the marches and couldn't go any farther, they put him in the hospital and x-rayed his back and found the problem. And after they treated him a while, they decided to send him back home to his family. And that's how he came out of the service. Then he decided, since he couldn't work in the coal mines anymore, his father and stepmother had moved down here to Hampton. He came down here to visit them. And his dad was doing carpenter work out here at Langley. And he tried to, and he talked Seth into coming down here and them building a boat and doing fishing and oystering out there in the river. And he thought that was pretty fascinating. So he came, and he uh, bought a boat, got it all painted up, and named it Doris Ann. It was a pretty little boat. And he and Granddad went out there trying to gather oysters. We nearly starved to death on that job because they just didn't know how to do it, and it was too hard for both of them. But there was a funny tale that your daddy told about when they pulled the boat in to the dock. There was another boat there, anchored pretty close to them, and I don't know why Granddad did that. He had his foot on Seth's boat and stepped his foot over on the other boat, and they began to drift apart. and he began to holler and squall, "Seth, what am I going to do? Better save me." He was about to fall in the water, and somehow or the other your daddy got him back over in his boat. He said, "Now you've bawled me out all my life. Now I think it's time for me to bawl you out. Don't you ever do another trick like that." So finally they sold that boat and decided to build one of their own. And they worked, and it was going to be a big one. But after they worked on it a while and said, "Well, there's no money in this, and I'm spending all my savings to live on because we were renting an apartment, renting a house up here in Copeland Park. I got to get a job and go to work." So then it's when he started doing carpenter work, and he and his dad began to work in Williamsburg. They were starting to restore Williamsburg, and they got a job up there restoring those buildings in Williamsburg, and they worked many years up there. Whenever I ever got to go up there to visit Williamsburg in these later years, well, I could see the buildings and see the handiwork that they did in those buildings up there. It's pretty fascinating, the work that they did. But I need to go back a little ways to tell how I met up with Seth. I knew his grandparents long before I did him. His grandfather, Jim Summerfield, Mary Summerfield. She was Mary Bibb. And they went to the same church that I went to when we moved to Gatewood. My father and mother moved to Gatewood because his job took him over there. And I went to a little Baptist church there. And I met his grandma and granddad and knew them, but I had never seen Seth. He went to the church, but I didn't know who he was, and he was one of the young people. But the way I met him was, one day, my mother was sending me to the grocery store, and I came out of the house with an apple in my hand. And Seth and his father was putting a roof on the school building. They had built a new room to the school building, which was just across the road from where we lived. And they were up on that new room putting the roof on it. And as I came out of there and came out the lane and started down the road to go to the store, he hollered real loud and said, "What is that you have in your hand?" And I hollered back, "I have an apple." "Why, are you hungry?" And I guess it was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He said, "Yes." So I walked over there and threw the apple up on the building to him and went on. Never thought a thing about that. But evidently he had been seeing me and knowing me around church, or knew who I was, but I didn't know it at the time, but he did know my dad. And so several weeks after that, somebody on the outside of the church, we didn't have air conditioning in the church then, you had the windows open, it was summertime. And I was sitting on about the second seat right next to the window. And somebody reached in that window and pulled my hair. And I turned around to see who it was. And I recognized that that was the guy I threw the apple to up on that building. And he whispered and said, "If I come in, can I sit with you?"